Welcome to One Symphony, a podcast that explores classical music's relevance in our modern lives. I'm conductor Devin Patrick Hughes, and I'm here to share with you stories and conversations with musicians, composers, and artistic entrepreneurs that aim to unite us into one symphonic world. From covering the fall of regimes around the world to celebrating the triumphs of music on Classic FM, John Suchet has always been a storyteller. Twice awarded for his international broadcasts, honored with the Royal Television Society's Lifetime Achievement Award, and beloved as the host of Classic FM's morning show and concert broadcasts, John has spent his second career championing Beethoven, the man, the myth, and the music. His new book, In Search of Beethoven, A Personal Journey, is exactly that, a journey that blends travel, biography, and memoir. It's my great pleasure to welcome back John Suchet to One Symphony. John, welcome back to One Symphony. I'm so excited to speak with you today. You are our first repeat guest in 6 years in the history of the show, so it's so great to speak with you again.
Thank you, Devin. Great pleasure to be with you.
It seems like you came out of the womb with a relationship to Beethoven. To me, the amazing thing about Beethoven is, and the reason why he's played after 200 years and probably will still be played after 2,000 years, is because he has this personal relationship to everyone who lives and breathes. And the great thing about your book, and it's the first of its kind that I've ever seen, is that you are chronicling that relationship that you have with him and that I believe everyone can have with him and his music. I would love to start asking about his childhood. Beethoven growing up on the Rhine, church bells in the air, 7 years already starting to tinker with composing. If we met young Beethoven on the street, what kind of kid would that be? And second question, as a young person, did you have any of those characteristics?
Short answer to the second question, definitely not. I certainly was not endowed with any great musical talent. In fact, I don't really know where my intense love of music comes from. My father insisted that I learn the piano and the violin at school. I didn't get on with the violin and I switched to the more forgiving trombone. And it was a great joy to me in writing this book that Beethoven had a real love of the trombone. He used it so much. Put all that to one side. Beethoven as a child in Bonn, he was already being seen as precocious at the age of 6 or 7. And in fact, as I relate in the book, his father put him on a public platform at the age of 7 in Cologne for his first ever public recital. And he advertised him, my child, as being 6 years of age, which has led to a lot of controversy. Would a father get the age of his son wrong, or was he deliberately falsifying his age to make him more comparable to the young genius of Mozart? Who knows? But he advertised him as being only 6 years of age. He was in fact 7. He accompanied a young singer, the soprano, who was a pupil of his father, and then he played some pieces himself. And there's no record of what he played. The father hasn't told us what he played, or indeed of how it went. And quite interesting that he should choose Cologne and not Bonn. Cologne, much more sophisticated city than Bonn, but it was at a distance from Bonn. So if it all went wrong, word probably wouldn't get back to Bonn. Who knows? But that was his first ever public performance. And he was only 7 years of age. So if you met him in Bonn at 7 years of age, he was already performing. There will have been a precocity about him. He was a precocious child. He never doubted his own great talent. And there's this wonderful story of the aged conductor who had gone a bit mad, marching through the streets of Bonn with a roll of music in one hand and a baton in the other. And he would go like this, banging on it as he walked through, always enter the house in which the Beethovens rented the first floor apartment, strike the thing, strike the table, point up at the apartment of the Beethovens and says, "Therein is musical genius." The boy Beethoven knew this and he used to laugh about it. And he said once to a friend, "There you are. madness awaits all of us musicians.
And this crazy guy was right. And one of the incredible things that I learned about in your book, I had known about Beethoven's walks, but I didn't know that he would go out into the countryside, waving his arms, making all these kind of musical and anti-musical sounds as he was in his raptus composing. And at one point, he drove the cattle away and he was kind of chased off by a farmer.
Absolutely right. Yes, absolutely right. It happened near Gneixendorf, where he went in his final full year of his life with his nephew, whose head was bandaged from a suicide attempt. And Beethoven was terminally ill. His stomach had distended to such an extent he had to wear a belt to keep his coat in place. His ankles were swollen. He was in the final stages of cirrhosis of the liver, almost certainly, brought on largely by alcoholic intake. And he was walking across the fields and shouting, making the noises, and the oxen stampeded, as you said, and the farmer was not best pleased. Beethoven was completely oblivious to it.
I want to get back to his father and his mentors. Customarily, a music student at this point in history would learn how to read sheet music as a pianist. It's my understanding Beethoven was going in the improvisational, compositional direction, encouraged by Nefe, his teacher, and Pfeiffer. But his father, Johann, was the opposite. His father had a stern musical upbringing from Ludwig, Beethoven's grandfather, and he was very disciplinarian. But at the same time, I was also struck that we think of Beethoven's father, Johann, as a kind of monster, dragging him down to the basement in the middle of the night and forcing him to perform for his other drunk friends. But you're saying this is a myth.
It is not true, Devin. It is absolutely not true, but it's taken hold so that every documentary or every drama about Beethoven you watch, you see the father coming home in the small hours, drunk with his friend, dragging the boy to the piano, striking his head. It just did not happen. As I say in the book, we only have one account of this, and the account was written by somebody who didn't know Beethoven as a child. He wrote it 30 or 40 years later, and the boy who grew up in the same house as the boy Beethoven, who wrote his memoir, admittedly decades later, doesn't mention it at all. Pfeiffer was the first teacher that the father employed, and he was a very good musician, but he was a drinker, and he would take the father drinking, and the father was a drinker. In fact, Beethoven's father was to become an alcoholic, which ruined his musical career. And it is true, they would come home at around midnight, for the worse the wear for too much drink. And all this chap who wrote many years later said is that the father would rouse the boy from sleep, take him to the piano, he would cry, but then he would play, and Pfeiffer would stay with him till dawn. Now, I'm not defending the father. He was not a perfect father, but there's no evidence he beat his hands. There's no evidence he was violent towards him. And okay, he woke him from sleep, which is not a nice thing to do, and took him to the piano. And I would imagine Beethoven didn't resist too much. And then with his teacher there, he would play till dawn. He was in his own world and he was happy. Now, there's no way Johann was the perfect father, but he was not the violent monster that history has portrayed him.
One of the things that I also enjoyed learning about during Beethoven's formative years is that we think of Beethoven in Vienna as a more mature musician, writing music for singers that's unplayable. And as he writes for musicians, he takes the philosophy, why should I worry about your technique when God is speaking to me? But this kind of disregard for the status quo when it comes to instrumental and vocal technique was happening also when he was a teenager in Bonn. And lucky for Beethoven, in history, his patron Count Waldstein was completely behind him and supporting him. But he was writing music. He was chosen to write big pieces, probably provoking jealousy from some of the other more established musicians. But I was amused to hear that when he was a teenager, folks were already complaining that his music is unplayable.
That's right. The first orchestral pieces that he composed in his life were when he was 19 years of age in Bonn. So he's well established by now as by far the most precocious, the most brilliant pianist in the town. And he's also already composed many pieces of chamber music for small ensembles. He's also composed a set of 3 piano sonatas. Now, he composed those when he was only 12 years of age. And whenever you see a new recording of the complete Beethoven piano sonatas, it's always 32, because he wrote all those 32 in Vienna, but he wrote 3 in Bonn at the age of 12. And Professor Barry Cooper, who's the finest British Beethoven authority, he's professor of musicology at the University of Manchester, has argued very convincingly that those first 3 must form part of the complete set. So in effect, he wrote 35. And the reason that they're ignored by many virtuosos is that he didn't give them opus numbers. He composed many pieces of music in Bonn, including the 2 orchestral pieces that I'm about to talk about, but he gave nothing that he composed in Bonn an opus number. In other words, once he got to Vienna, he put all Bonn compositions behind him as if they're not worthy of an opus number. I believe that we can judge better than he could that they are worthy of an opus number. And the 2 orchestral pieces he was commissioned to write when he was 19, the Emperor in Vienna, the Emperor, the Habsburg Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, died. And he was an extremely popular, Emperor Joseph, very popular. He did a lot of modernization, sanitation, and he was well loved. He was the son of Empress Maria Theresa, the great mother of the nation. He died, and his brother succeeded him, who only lasted a year or 2 before he died. But when this happened, the orchestra in Bonn, which was highly accomplished, the Prince Elector in Bonn, who was the brother of the emperor, said to the orchestra, I want compositions to mark the death of the emperor and the elevation of the new emperor. The leading musicians in Bonn chose Beethoven, who was only 19 years of age, which put a lot of noses out of joint from more senior musicians. But they also hired a young poet who wrote words about the dead emperor, and his words were actually quite seditious. He said this man was a reformer and blah, blah, blah. He was a rather seditious young poet. Beethoven was already at 19. His head was full of revolutionary ideas from Nefer, his great teacher, who was a Protestant in a Catholic town. And he was a member of the Illuminati, which was an organization that was proscribed. He filled the young boy's head with revolutionary ideals. So when Beethoven composed these 2 pieces for full orchestra, the cantata on the death of the emperor and the cantata on the elevation of the new emperor, and they are magnificent. The first one, the cantata on the death, is better than the one on the elevation, and it is a supreme composition. And in fact, there's a wonderful passage in it where the oboe soars above the soprano who's singing. And that's something that he saved and used again in Fidelio in the dungeon scene.
Und ist nicht mein Grab mir erhellet. Ich seh wie ein Engel im rosigen Duft sich tröstend zur Seite mich stellet. Ein Engel Leonoren der Göttin sogleich der führt mich zur Freiheit, mich
Like all great composers, you never waste a good idea. But the orchestra in Bonn, which was highly proficient, refused to perform these pieces because they said he doesn't understand our instruments. He's written stuff that's unplayable. And it was always the woodwind section or the brass section that complained. And they refused to play it. They never played it as the Prince Elector had intended them to do. And in fact, those first two orchestral pieces by Beethoven were never performed in his lifetime, not even when he got to Vienna. So he never heard them. They're widely available on disc or download. And to anyone who doesn't know them, listen to the cantata on the Death of the Emperor. It's a superb composition. But as I say, the musician said, he doesn't understand our instruments. It's unplayable. If they were wrong, he was right.
So getting Beethoven up to speed with the great masters that came before him. Christian Neff is a fascinating figure, like many Beethoven connections along the composer's path. Many teachers or supporters doing such great work for humanity in supporting Beethoven, or very skilled people who Beethoven comes across who we wouldn't know historically if they hadn't crossed paths with Beethoven. I'm curious what revolutionary ideas Beethoven picked up around this time. Obviously, there's the Enlightenment, there's the French Revolution that's happening around this time, there's the founding of American democracy. But what was the advantage of living in Bonn and being a student of Neff as musical, but also the kind of ideals that he passed to Beethoven? Because we think of Beethoven as a revolutionary. There's not that many composers who we think of as trying to move the humanitarian tides or trying to have a say in how a society should operate. Can you talk about how Beethoven fits those parameters and maybe how Neff inspired that?
Yes, I can. The important thing is that Beethoven was born in the little provincial German town of Bonn, which was hundreds of miles away from Vienna. Now, Vienna was the capital city of the Holy Roman Empire. Formal, correct, proper. You wear wigs and stockings. You dress properly. You speak with a beautifully refined accent. And it was already then Europe's capital city of music. Remember, Mozart had lived there for the last 10 years of his life. And sadly, Mozart died a year or 2 years before Beethoven arrived there to stay permanently. So the two didn't meet at that stage. They'd met a little bit earlier. And Mozart was the first to start breaking the rules. He hated all the formality. He didn't use proper titles. And Vienna, as I say, was this strict, proper place, which it still is today. You can go to the humblest cafe in Vienna for a morning coffee, and the waiters are always in starched linen bow ties, often with tailcoats. Germany was and is far more relaxed. And Bonn, being a provincial German town, hundreds of miles away from Vienna, was a much more relaxed atmosphere. Now, the Archbishop of Cologne and Münster, who was the brother of Maria Antonia, who's entered history as Marie Antoinette, who was guillotined during the Revolution with Louis XVI in Paris. Now, the Prince Elector in Bonn, who was also the Archbishop of Cologne and Münster, had his own orchestra and his own choir, a bit like Salzburg, although Salzburg was then an independent city-state within Austria. the archbishop there had his own orchestra that the Mozart father and son played in. Bonn, too, they had their own orchestra. It's a very cultural city, Bonn. But because it was so far from Vienna, the strict formal rules didn't apply. And Nefer, Christian Gottlob Nefer, who the father employed as teacher for Beethoven when Beethoven was around 12 or 13 years of age, Nefer was the perfect teacher. He came to Bonn with I forget the name of it, but a touring operatic and musical company. And he landed a job as a court organist because he was a good organizer. He was also a composer, and he was, as I said earlier, a Protestant. It was unheard. A Protestant would never have landed a job like that in Vienna, which was a strict Roman Catholic city. But in Bonn, that's fine. We're relaxed about that sort of thing. Now, Nefer was in tune with what was happening in Europe. As you rightly pointed out, in 1789, the French Revolution. In 91 was the Great Terror, where they tried to annihilate the entire aristocracy, guillotining them. Then after that, the king went to the guillotine. Then his queen went to the guillotine. And in Vienna, this was utterly appalling, because what was now the longest serving monarchy on continental Europe, the Habsburgs, based in Vienna. So Metternich, who was in charge of Vienna, shut the city down, but still in Bonn, they were quite relaxed about the French Revolution. That's a long way away from us. So Nefer, a Protestant, got the job as court organist. Beethoven's father employed Nefer to teach him, which was the best thing he could have done. And Nefer, being a Protestant with Enlightenment ideals, the Enlightenment was sweeping Europe in the run-up to the French Revolution. For the first time, the divine right of kings was being questioned. The power of the clergy was being questioned. And without any doubt, though we have no proof of this, but Nefer, in the small confines of a piano room, teaching a boy of 13 or 14 years of age, he will have filled the young boy's head with Enlightenment ideals. And as a Protestant, he will have said, don't worry about the difference between Protestants and Catholics. We're musicians, that's what counts. And the freedom of people, forget the divine right of kings and all this sort of thing. Most importantly of all, Nefer was himself a composer. So when a 12-year-old Ludwig said to him, I want to compose, Nefer encouraged him. He was so good on the piano, the boy, that Nefer encouraged him to compose. Now, a lesser teacher might have said to the boy, look, learn to walk before you try to run. Forget this composing nonsense. You're only 12 years of age. Learn the piano. But he didn't. He encouraged the boy to compose. Hence, those 3 piano sonatas that he composed at the age of 12, which are extraordinary works. Now, without a doubt, Nefer will have helped him. He might even have written a few bars. He certainly helped him write the dedication, which is the most fawning dedication to the Prince Elector in Bonn, the Archbishop of Cologne and Münster. Your supreme noble highness, my unworthy efforts, I wish to dedicate to your greatness. It's all this kind of stuff. Nefer will have helped him write that, but he got them published. And so he encouraged the boy as young as 12 to compose. And he wrote soon after that, he placed a piece in a music magazine, Kramer's music magazine, in which he said, if only this boy were given sufficient funds to travel, he could go to Vienna and meet Mozart. And that was the first time that Beethoven's name had appeared in print alongside Mozart's. And it was to happen, but not until Nefer sadly left soon after, because the touring company moved on. He managed to get employment for the boy as his assistant court organist. And when Nefer was away on duty, Beethoven, at the age of 13, played organ at the Sunday morning mass, dressed in a velvet suit with a sword hanging at his side, patent leather shoes, and the Prince Elector in attendance, and a very proud father in attendance. And that was the only paid, he got a minuscule salary for it, and it was the only paid employment of his entire life, and he was 13. So it was Nefer who filled his head with these ideas, encouraged him to compose, because in Bonn, as opposed to Vienna, much more relaxed, much more, just take it easy, let's do our own thing.
One of the things that fascinates me across history, say, take Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. The first time they put Beethoven together with Abraham Lincoln and Napoleon, they bring them all back, right? Beethoven actually could have met Napoleon. I don't think he ever did. He almost did once.
He wanted to meet him, but he never got the invitation. When Napoleon installed himself in Schönbrunn Palace in 1806, Beethoven was waiting for the invitation, but it never came.
One of the things that has fascinated me for a very long time, and you shed a lot of new light on, is this meeting between Beethoven and Mozart. There's a lot of mythology around it. We don't know exactly what was said, exactly how many lessons, or even if Beethoven actually even had lessons. Can you talk about how that happened?
Yes, ever since a biography of Beethoven that was published, I think in the 1890s or the early 1900s, this musicologist discovered that we all knew that Beethoven went to Vienna to meet Mozart in April 1787, when he was 16 years of age, and he checked into a hotel in Munich, and then 3 weeks later, he checked into the same hotel. So this chap wrote that he checked into the hotel in Munich, went to Vienna, heard from his father back in Bonn that his mother was dangerously ill, come back immediately, left immediately, checked back into that hotel 3 weeks later, and then carried on back to Vienna. But new research came out only about 10 or 15 years ago, which I found, I have to confess, I almost stumbled across it because it's buried deep in a book in German, but someone had alerted me to this, and I acquired the book, and with a lot of thumbing of the dictionary, I translated it. This chap discovered that this long-held theory that Beethoven was in Vienna for 3 weeks, met Mozart once, who agreed to take him on as a pupil, but word came his mother was ill, so come back immediately, and he left. That's not what happened at all. On the way to Vienna, he never went via Munich. He left in January, not April, and he went via Regensburg, which is north of Munich. And from Regensburg, he went to Vienna. And he stayed in Vienna not for 3 weeks, but for at least 4 months, from January through to April 1787. Now, Mozart was backwards and forwards from Vienna to Prague, where he was premiering, I forget which opera it was now.
Don Giovanni.
And there was a period, though, of about 4 or 5 weeks when they were both in Vienna. Did they meet? There is no record. We simply do not know. But I think it is inconceivable that they did not meet, because Beethoven knew how great Mozart was. His compositions would appear in Bonn as soon as they came out. He knew about his operas, but there's no record of them meeting. When he finally left in April, he checked into this hotel in Munich, but from there he went back up to Regensburg, stayed there for 3 weeks, and came back down to Munich, checked in again, then came home. So this original musicologist, 150 or so years ago, got the checking in correct, but he assumed he checked in once on the way to Vienna and once on the way back from Vienna. It's not true. Both checkings in were on the way back from Vienna with Regensburg in between. So he left, we now know, in January for Vienna. So he was in Vienna for much longer than we thought, for about 150 years. But there's still no knowledge or evidence of a meeting between the two of them, and neither of them ever mentioned it in later life. So it's a bit of a mystery, and one day it might be resolved. Something might come to light to resolve it.
Maybe a security camera comes to light that captured some footage. How do you think that lesson or meeting would have went down?
Legend is that Mozart, they met once, and this may well be true, that Mozart said, because he was not in the mood to see anyone. His health was not good. He had just come out of a really bad fever. He was working very hard on Don Giovanni, and I think his father died later that year. So there's a lot on his mind. This boy from Bonn turns up who was ugly. Mozart loved beauty of all things. He was particularly careful about how he dressed. He liked to dress very nicely. This boy with ill-fitting clothes that needed repair, hair all over the place, pockmarked face. Oh, what do you want? I've been told you're good. Sit at the piano and play something. And Beethoven, it's thought, played the opening of Mozart's A minor piano concerto, which after an orchestral introduction begins solo piano. And Mozart said, no, you've obviously prepared that. Play something of your own. Now, as Mozart's great skill, even at that age, was improvisation. And I like to think that Beethoven said to him, Herr Mozart, give me a melody, give me a tune, and I'll improvise on it for you. I like to think that maybe Mozart gave him a theme from Don Giovanni. Who knows? Beethoven improvised on it endlessly. And the legend is that Mozart went into the next room and said to his wife, who was entertaining friends, watch out for that boy. One day he will give the world something to talk about, which is quite possible.
Do you think Mozart would have heard about Beethoven before that meeting?
It's a good question. Would Mozart have heard of Beethoven when Beethoven was only 16? Probably not. Mozart had enough on his own mind, zipping between Vienna and Prague. We're talking of only 4 years before he died, and he's in Vienna working his socks off. No, he probably hadn't heard of Beethoven, the boy, at that stage.
Thank you for joining us on One Symphony. Special thanks to John Suchet for sharing his personal journey with the music and life of Beethoven. For musical selections featured on today's show, see the show notes online. For more information on John Suchet, see www.johnsuchet.co.uk. You can find his most recent book, In Search of Beethoven, A Personal Journey, wherever books are sold. You can always find more info at onesymphony.podbean.com. If you appreciate what we do, you can support the show and get exclusive content at patreon.com/onesymphony with Devin Patrick Hughes. Feel free to rate, review, or share the podcast. Until next time, thank you for being part of the music.